I'm not going to ask you to hold your hand up and ask you if you read the lesson or not, but how many caught the typo that was on the first page of the lesson tonight? Any? It was not Union troops that fired upon Fort Sumter, but it was Confederate troops that fired on Union troops at Fort Sumter. I guess that scared me for the rest of the lesson. It wasn't not that I was going to trust what this guy was going to say. But this was, I had known a number of these things about David Lipscomb. This lesson and the next lesson both will deal with David Lipscomb. And the reason for it is because of the tremendous influence that he had on the church in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And even still today, the paper that he started, the Gospel Advocate, is still in publication today. There were a number of church papers that went on. One was the Christian Herald that was published out of Cincinnati, Ohio. There were several others that maybe were not weekly papers as the Gospel Advocate was. But it was also an opening, a forum for which people could express themselves of how they felt. And it is kind of interesting to notice that men like David Lipscomb, and some of the things that will come out in our lesson tonight of his position were kind of different from the direction that he took his spiritual stance. So let me go through this as we go, and I'll point these out as we come to them. The opening statement is one that he made in 1889. The mission of the kingdom of God is to break into pieces and consume all earthly kingdoms, take their place, fill the whole earth, and stand forever. Do any of you know where that concept came from? The book of Daniel, where the great image that Nebuchadnezzar had made, the dream that he had was that there was a great mountain, and out of this mountain came a great rock, and it rolled down and it smashed this image to small pieces. This seems to be the point where he grabbed hold of this statement and to begin to sit on to a concept that I do not subscribe to, which is millennialism. And that is that he believed that Christ was going to come back to the earth and that he was going to establish his kingdom upon the face of the earth, and that those that were in the church would have a time of great peace and prosperity. So here we have the picture. And I'm not too sure at the bottom of that picture if it doesn't say the same thing he said on this, but it was Confederate troops firing on Fort Sumter. And I went back and did some reading on this. Fort Sumter had not been completed at this particular time. Union troops were sent there in order to control the harbor, and the Confederate troops opened fire, and after a short period of time, the Union troops surrendered. And that was the beginning of the Civil War that we experienced in this country. When all of this happened, when this war broke out, there were Christians of the Restoration movement faced a very important and a very disturbing question. One, would they remain loyal to their region of the country and fight, or would they oppose the war out of a higher allegiance? I think times changed considerably from 1861 to about 1910, at least in particular, because of things that began to transpire on the political level throughout the world. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. In the 1860s, in the northern level, this would be north of the Mason-Dixon line, there were about 1,200 congregations. At this particular time, they were all known as the Christian church. There had not been a separation between the churches of Christ and the Christian church. My grandmother, David Wallace's mother, said she grew up, and for many, many years, all she ever knew was the Christian church. And then about 1904, there was a distinction being made very especially between what today is now the Disciples of Christ and the independent churches, which were known as the Churches of Christ. In the South, there were about 800 congregations, and this included what was found in North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, and also in Missouri, and probably there were not as many in the state of Texas at that time. Today, Texas is a place where there are quite a few congregations. There were border states in the Civil War in which there were congregations. One was Missouri. The other was the state of Kentucky, in which there were very divided positions upon whether or not they were serving the Union or serving the Confederacy. And even in the state of Tennessee, in my family, my great-great-great-grandfather served in the Union Army. He had 3 sons in the Confederate Army, and he had 3 sons in the Union Army. So not only were areas divided, but there were also families that were very much divided. And all of this has to be mentioned because this is what precludes the thinking of the church and some of the church leaders in the mid to late 1800s. The whole point was, and the question really was, what were sincere Christians going to do? In latter times, attitudes, I think, have changed considerably. And we have had great numbers of Christians that have served in the military. And the military has changed somewhat considerably too. One of the elders that I served under in Somerset had started out as a chaplain in the Army, and when the Air Force decided they were going to have Church of Christ chaplains, he switched over to the Air Force and retired a lieutenant colonel after serving for many years as an Air Force chaplain, and also as an Army chaplain for many of those years. There were a lot of individuals in the church that argued both directions. Some held pacifist views, meaning that they did not want to engage in war. They didn't want to be involved in the conflict. And yet within all of this caused conflict within congregations. They argued that it was wrong to fight in a war in which one might well kill other Christians. I guess it's all right to kill other heathens, but to think that they might kill a brother in Christ was one of the sticking points to why that they fought against this. Men such as Alexander Campbell and Talbot Fanning, Moses Lard, J.W. McGarvey, Benjamin Franklin, and David Lipscomb all took a position and urged Christians to stay out of the war. Now, this Benjamin Franklin that is mentioned here, we'll deal with him considerably in the next, either the next lesson or the lesson after that. This is not the Benjamin Franklin that flew the kite. This is just another fellow that has the name Benjamin Franklin. And he was a Restoration preacher and evidently a very forceful and a very influential individual. J.W. McGarvey even went to the point of writing to Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, and asked for a conscientious objector status for Christians in the South. I'm not sure that the concept of accepting other Protestant religious groups as being Christians was what was involved with this, because if that had happened, there wouldn't have been anybody in the South left to fight. Because generally throughout the South, you had Methodist and Presbyterian, and you had Baptist, which was the strongest group, and you had the Christian church. And most of these people were divided in their own congregations of how that they felt that they needed to go to war. The war separated the northern church from the southern church in all instances. Today, even the Baptist church is still divided into what is called the American Baptist Church and the Southern Baptist Church. And that's the reason that those two exist like that is because of the Civil War. There have always been quite a bit of difference in the thinking between Yankees and Southerners. And it has always been a difficulty. And even prior to the war, during the war, and even since the war took place. McGarvey said, "I'd rather 10,000 times be killed for refusing to fight than to fall in battle or come home victorious with the blood of my brethren on my hands." So you can understand that this was a very heated subject with the churches at this particular time. I mean, it wasn't just in the Christian church, but it was also in all of the Protestant churches also. I thought this was an interesting statement. You take the North and the South, and suppose that of the 12 apostles that Jesus had, 6 were from northern Israel and 6 were from southern Israel, and they couldn't get along, and they were trying to decide would they be urging their brethren to go to war. Now, that within itself was an eye-opener for me. I had never thought in terms of something like that. But I suppose it could be a problem. I suppose that if Jesus was born in the the USA and had chosen his disciples here and had lived during the time of the Civil War, then this might have been a problem. It was enough of a problem of getting them to agree on everything that needed to be agreed upon. There were some that seemed to be very headstrong, and others that we never heard anything about, so we just really don't know much about them.
We're glad that God sent Jesus at the right time and not wait until another time.
Yeah. Well, the scripture says in the fullness of time that God had sent his son. And I've always thought in terms of that statement is that if God had sent his son prior to that time, the effect of his being here would have been less than what it was. And if he had brought him even today instead of when he did, that the effect would even be less. I think as more people there are in the world, there's fewer and fewer that really accept Jesus as being Christ, the Son of the living God. Among the churches of Christ, this man, David Lipscomb, kind of emerged as one of the most influential leaders. He was born near Highland in Franklin County, Tennessee. Here's kind of a bio of him. There were 2 other important people that came from that general area down there. You know who they were? Phil Fulmer was one. Johnny Majors was the other. So Huntland is about this big. And it's amazing to have all of these people from this general area that we've had some kind of contact with. He was born in 1831. He died in 1917 at the age of 86. He organized and founded the Nashville Bible School. My grandmother attended the Nashville Bible School. At that time, it was a 2-year college. When she left that, she taught music in public schools. It is now today known as Lipscomb University, and was at one time known the merriest 40 acres on the God's green earth, and it may still be. He was greatly involved in the American Restoration movement, and so this is, I think, Wikipedia's definition of who he is. And if you look carefully at him, you'll find that he looks an awful lot like David Wallace. Or David Wallace looks a lot like him. I know that, and I can get away with that. We get along very well. One thing that caused him to take the position of a pacifist was the fact that he witnessed the Battle of Nashville on December the 15th and the 16th in 1864. During those 2 days, there were 3,000 Union soldiers and there were 1,500 Confederate soldiers that died. I don't know if you have ever been in the presence of a terrible accident where there have been multiple casualties, or at least multiple, or even multiple deaths. But it's an unhinging thing that takes place. And those that are serving have to take a position that it cannot affect them because of those that need to be cared for at this time. But imagine 4,500 dead bodies lying around in the town, in the city. How to take care of them, what to do with them. Today we'd take a bulldozer and dig out a big trench and just shove all the bodies into it and have what we call a mass burial. But if you go and look at the cemeteries that are found around Nashville, you found that most of these soldiers, both Union and Confederate, have a personal grave, and it's personally marked. And that within itself was something that was very different from other wars that had gone on. Lipscomb was very successful in encouraging a lot of folks not to get involved in the war. And he spent most of the rest of his life opposing Christian involvement in war. In fact, as we look at this, not only was he opposed to war, but he was opposed to Christian involvement in political affairs. He did not encourage Christians to run for office. He taught that Christians should not vote. And you also have to remember this was a time in which women did not have the vote anyway, but this was for men. And there was a poll tax that had to be paid, which meant that in order to vote, you had to give the people a certain amount of money, and then you were entitled to vote. I don't know what they did with it. He also founded and edited the Gospel Advocate, which we've already mentioned, and it ran from 1866 to 1912, and then there was a different editor that took over the paper at that particular time. This was getting close to the end of his life. At this time, he was up in his 80s, and it was a difficult time for him. In fact, I think he was one of the most influential leaders among Southern churches of Christ in the second half of the 19th century. And in order to understand his pacifism, we have to see the roots in his understanding of the kingdom of God. Lipscomb had taken in much of what Alexander Campbell had taken as a position, such as that which was rational and common sense theology. Now, this goes back to when he was instructed by the Haldanes in Scotland, in which a lot of their position and thinking came from John Locke, who was a great philosophical thinker, I guess. I've read some of his stuff, and I'm not too sure how bright he really was anyway. But all of this came down to being common sense. This is why Alexander Campbell had a problem in the early years of the development of the Restoration movement, that everything sort of had this, and then almost a checklist of things that this is what had to be done. And I think sometimes some of that has been inherited by our generation to some degree. Richard Hughes, and I don't know anything about him, wrote this about David Lipscomb. He said that his writings reveal an understanding of the kingdom that was remarkably similar to Barton W. Stone. And I would think that maybe today that much of the traditional views that we hold today in the South and in this 21st century had a lot of their beginnings with Barton W. Stone. You remember that Stone and Campbell had quite a bit of differences as we look back at that in an earlier lesson. And part of this was that Stone felt like there needed to be more spiritual feelings. There needed to be more spiritual understanding as far as the kingdom and the expression of worship. And Campbell said, well, you know, as long as you follow the form that is there. And I think sometimes that we have gone maybe too far in that too. By the year of 1831, in which Lipscomb was born, his father and his uncles had been expelled from the Baptist church that was down near Huntland and were united with a Stonite church. Now, a Stonite church is one that follows the teachings of Barton W. Stone. Now, one thing you have to remember about these restoration preachers, and most of them were not what we would call a located preacher like we have today. These men would go out on tours and would be gone for months at a time, and they would visit congregations as they traveled in distant places and go and visit and preach in these different places. And when they showed up, of course, they would be invited to preach. And the reason for that was, but oftentimes these little small congregations out in the country didn't have a preacher, didn't have anybody regularly that would come in. And so this would be sort of like when Paul would show up at a synagogue in the New Testament times, he would be invited to speak. And this is the way that often church services took place in those days and times. According to Lipscomb, the first preacher of the Restoration movement that he remembered hearing was Thacker V. Griffin at the Salem Church on Beans Creek in Franklin County, Tennessee. And this was the church that was established by the Stonite preacher James Matthews. Lipscomb's mentor was a man by the name of Talbert Fanning. Talbert Fanning has one of the dormitories named after him at Lipscomb University. In fact, I think my wife, you stayed at Fanning, didn't you? Okay. Each of the halls, dormitories or resident halls at Lipscomb are named for some of the famous individuals during the Restoration movement. There's Elam Hall, Fanning Hall, Sewell Hall, Johnson Hall, all of these, and then High Rise, and I don't know who that was. I guess that was the guy that wore his breeches up around his armpits. Campbell had a lot of influence. He also wrote and was writing long before Lipscomb started his paper. And in fact, Lipscomb reported that he had read every issue of Alexander Campbell's Millennial Harbinger since he was 10 years old. This is a copy of the first volume of the Millennial Harbinger. I have some reprints of it in my library. It's very laborious in reading. These guys did not write on a 3-minute schedule like we live on today. And we perhaps don't have as many scholarly preachers as existed in the time of Campbell and Lipscomb. But you also have to remember they didn't have smartphones, they didn't have telephones, they didn't even have telegraph, I guess, except maybe from the bigger cities to the bigger cities. They did not have television, they did not have radio, and oftentimes when you got a newspaper, it was anywhere from 3 to 5 to 6 weeks late, and everything had already taken place and was over with by the time that you read about it. But the Millennial Harbinger was a monthly publication. Lipscomb decided that he would make his a weekly review that went out. To remind you a little bit about Alexander Campbell, he lived from 1788 to 1866. He was basically called the mind of the movement of the Restoration movement. He came from Scotland in 1809 in order to be with his father Thomas, who had been here in America for several years previously. By 1812, he'd gotten to the point of believers-only baptism and moved away from infant baptism. In 1820, he had the great Campbell Walker debate. In 1830, the Millennial Harbinger was begun. And in 1840, he established Bethany College in Bethany, West Virginia. And that college still is in existence today. Kind of reminds you a little bit of Old Hickory, doesn't it? But I guess in those days they didn't have many combs. I don't need one either. Like Stone, Lipscomb believed that all human government represented the rebellion of humankind against God's sovereign rule and the transferring of allegiance to the kingdom of Satan. This is a point that I had difficulties in trying to get a hold of and to see where he was coming from and what was going on. He cites the case of Nimrod. And I don't know if you remember who Nimrod was, but here's a family tree. There was Noah. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham had a son by the name of Cush. And Cush had a son by the name of Nimrod, and Nimrod was a mighty hunter. He not only was a mighty hunter, but he also became a founder of cities. Not only did he work in the fields and out in the woods, but he also became an urbanite. He started founding cities. And it's kind of interesting when you think about where Lipscomb took his stand. It goes back to this passage that's found in Genesis 10 and verse 8. It says, Cush became the father of Nimrod, and he was the first on the earth to become a mighty warrior, and he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And that was the saying that went around. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, all of them in the land of Shinar. And from that land he went into Assyria. He built Nineveh, Rehoboth-er, Calah, Resen, between Nineveh and Calah, which is the great city. So the city of Babel and the city of Nineveh that we can identify with as we remember our Bible lessons become important. What do you remember about Babel? Huh? The Tower of Babel. Okay. The Tower of Babel was a sign of rebellion against God. The whole purpose of building the Tower of Babel was to build it to heaven itself. Now, here's a picture that somebody's depicted of what they thought the Tower of Babel looked like. Now, I don't know when they took that picture, but evidently it was a long time ago, because I suspect that the Tower of Babel was not round. I suspect that it was square and was made what is called a ziggurat. And a ziggurat is much like, are you familiar with the Mayan temples down in Mexico? About the pyramids. I'm not too sure that as bright as these people were that built these great edifices were smart enough to build something that was round, at least on this kind of scale. But whoever drew this picture, that was their concept of it, and it's probably as good as anybody else's. It's sort of like I have a discourse with people who believe that Adam ate an apple and Eve ate an apple. I think it was a kumquat. And I've got just as much scriptural evidence that it was a kumquat as anybody has that it was an apple. So it doesn't make any difference. It looked good and was desirous to make one wise. And surely a kumquat do that. You bite into kumquat and you find out it's kind of sour, but it's also a little sweet. So you learn something from eating a kumquat. Lipscomb's position was that this was when God confounded the languages of the people in order to scatter them abroad, because they were moving further and further away from God and His system. And so this becomes important. Lipscomb's position said that under human governments, the earth became a place of confusion, strife, bloodshed, and perpetual warfare. Now, these next statements really get pretty stiff. The chief occupation of human governments from the beginning has been war. Okay, if you want to buy that one, okay, that's fine. And this was the one that I had the most trouble with. 9/10 of the taxes paid by the human family have gone to preparing for, carrying on, or paying the expenses of war. Now, at this particular time, there was not an office of budget management. There was no way to get facts and figures out to the average individual except that they were months or maybe even years behind. And to conclude that 9/10 of your taxes or the taxes of the people of this day and time were going to pay for the expenses of war, I think is stretching it just maybe more than just a little bit. And I'm not sure that he could back that up with facts anyway. It just was something that he made a comment about, and it was also something in which he used as an argument for his particular position.
You know, back in his day, there wasn't as much infrastructure, and that, I don't know how you guys did it. That could be. He may have Googled it. that could be close.
Well, back in those days, they didn't have Google, they had Gobble. They had these turkeys that ran around. We still got some of the turkeys running around today, too. Okay.
I don't appreciate the second comment either.
Which one?
The one about government, in the beginning, all the reason for governments is war.
Like I said, these two statements really caused me a lot of problems. And the reason for that is what I found in the book of Romans. I don't think Lipscomb ever read the book of Romans. Because listen to this passage in Romans 13. You didn't know I was going to have this up next, did you? No, you didn't. Listen to this now. According to verses what Lipscomb believed, and this was what was being taught now to the people of his day and time. And this was actually a total reversal of what Paul says in the book of Romans. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. Doesn't say that God is the only authority. It says the authority has come from God. And therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of the authority? Then do what's good. You'll receive its approval. For it is God's servant for your good. But if you do what's wrong, then you should be afraid, for the authority does not bear the sword in vain. It's the servant of God to execute. The government is the servant of God to execute wrath upon the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be subject not only because of wrath, but also because of conscience. For the same reason, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants busy with this very thing. Now, this passage not only deals with the government and our responsibility to, but it deals with that fact you got to pay taxes. Now, we may not like to do that. There are a lot of things we may not like. We may not like having to get up in the morning and go to work or get up and do whatever it is that we have to do. But we do it. And governments are given for the very purpose of keeping order throughout the government, whether it's on the local situation, whether it's the city, the county, the state, or the union itself. There is a purpose for that, and Paul makes this statement that I think rejects almost everything that Lipscomb stood for in his pacifism against earthly representation. Now, in talking about this kingdom, when we go back to the statement that we begin with, that God's kingdom is going to come down and it's going to smash all these governments and to pieces and going to be a national ruling. Again, this is part of his thinking. This kingdom in its present churchly form, however, was not the everlasting kingdom, but rather the kingdom in a lower state of growth and development. Now notice very carefully here, he's beginning to make a differing thing between also what Paul says in Thessalonians about the fact of the end of the world. Now to him, there was not going to be an end of the world, because his position was that when Christ came a second time, he was going to establish a worldwide kingdom, and everybody was going to be subject to it, and it was going to be very much like the church, period. He says, the time will come when Christ will put down all rule and all authority and all power, and Christ's kingdom shall break in pieces and consume all the kingdoms of earthly origin. Now notice again that his positioning on this comes from the Old Testament and not what is found in the New Testament and changes that took place. I think that most of us have understood over time that what was predicted in the book of Daniel was simply a coming of the emerging nations that were going to rule the then known world, and pretty much followed almost word for word exactly what was going to take place. Lipscomb thought this earth itself would be transformed. Briars and thorns and material and spiritual will no longer grow. The atmosphere will be purified of its rebellious taint, and death will be destroyed, and this world will become the Eden of happiness and peace. From this, what do you gather? What does he believe? This is going to be heaven. And you have to remember, and this is a whole different story of these concepts that have come out. Millennialism, premillennialism, anti-millennialism, all of these are different doctrines that have come more or less from the book of Revelation, and do not and will not accept things like what's found in Thessalonians, which says when Jesus comes back again, there's going to be a big trumpet that sounds, the archangel's going to shout, those that are in the graves are going to get up, those that are children of God are going to get up, and those that are Christians and are still alive, then we're going to be caught up to meet him in the air. Now, it doesn't say anything about us coming back down. Huh? Like you've heard me say, I want to be in front of the biggest cemetery in town. I want to see this happen. Man, that'll beat Hollywood all to pieces. But they'd want to make a movie out of it, but they won't have time. As these quotes show, Lipscomb clearly envisioned a restored and perfected millennial kingdom on earth. And he refused to speculate about whether or not Jesus would reign over this earthly kingdom for a literal 1,000 years. And such a question, he thought, was among the untaught questions best left to God alone. So basically, when he proposed things like this, and people said, well, what's going to happen? How's this going to take place? He said, I don't know, and it's up to God. To start. It's sort of like going into a room and the lamp's been broken, there's one child in there, and you say, who broke this lamp? The kid says, I don't know. You know? That to me was not an out. There were people who challenged his thinking on this time and time again. And I think that as we examine and find out where this position is, that his position is, we understand where the church was being led. And fortunately, we've had others with pretty good thinking that have led us away from this kind of thing. For Lipscomb, he said that Christians should stand aloof from civil government. This meant that if the government did something or said something that you disagreed with, that you just bit your lip and you didn't say anything, didn't do anything. And also that they should not hold political offices. Christians should not. They should not participate in war, and they should not vote. And again and again and again, these were continuing themes that he proposed. But I guess he paid taxes because they never put him in jail. Now here's some of Lipscomb's thoughts. Christians should stand apart, living lives of simplicity, sacrifice, and service, expecting as a matter of course the misunderstanding and the scorn of the world. It makes no difference whether you do what is right or you do what is wrong. You're going to have people that are going to take the opposite side of it. There are some people that are not happy unless they can make you unhappy. And there are people that, no matter what the position is or what statement has been made, they feel it's their responsibility, not a right, but their responsibility to take the opposite side of it. And we see where all that gets to. It gets to what is called a stalemate, in which neither side can go in either direction, and we just kind of in the mud puddle on a bicycle, and we're just pedaling as hard as we can, the wheel's spinning, but we're not getting anywhere. This kind of stand, the idea of living in simplicity and sacrifice and service, those are great attributes. But you can also be active in doing things to help influence your community to be a better place than what it is. Pacifist views like Lipscomb's remained strong among churches of Christ until the early 20th century. And even though a good many who embraced pacifism rejected or simply did not understand the view of God's kingdom that undergirded it, Lipscomb's outlook did influence a significant circle of people, both rich and poor. And as a result, there were leanings of the church and separations in the churches over this very viewpoint. And then happened World War I and World War II. These, I think, had perhaps as much change upon the general thinking of the pacifist as anything in the world. How many of you remember the draft poster, Uncle Sam Wants You? They didn't care whether you were Baptist or Methodist or Church of Christ or Christian or Episcopalian or Catholic. They just needed warm bodies to send over for cannon fodder. By the time that World War II came along, Lipscomb's outlook with its dim view of all human governments and its sole allegiance to God's kingdom and pacifism had eroded pretty badly. And the concept of a nation going to war, again, was one that had to be faced. Churches of Christ were growing increasingly at home in mainstream American culture and ever more content with the conventional Protestant morality. With the war fever raging, the strict pacifist stance prominent in Lipscomb's time made little sense to a lot of people. I'm not sure how to express the change that took place, except that many were now taking the position that it was not the individual that was going to war and killing other individuals, but they were in subjection to their government, and their government had made the decision to go to war, and they were only a tool, an instrument of dealing with that warfare. For those of you that have served in the military, I don't know if that was one of the things that was ever discussed with you or taught with you, other than the fact that you do what you're told to do, period. And if you do, you do well better much better than you will if you don't. And so this change not only happened on the political front out in the communities and throughout the nation, but it also moved inside the church buildings. And there were heated discussions that took place of whether or not that people needed to, ought to, could involve themselves in war. Some took the position that I can go to war and I can drive a truck. I don't have to fire a gun. Well, I got news for you. If you pay taxes, you're supporting the war effort. You've got to be careful where you take your stand. And I think that you have to understand that the spiritual kingdom is very different from the material kingdom. And we live in both. We have a physical body, but we also have a spiritual soul. We are a dual existent being, the physical part and the spiritual part. And I think that is the kind of an explanation to the understanding of our allegiance both to a federal government and also to the spiritual government. Now, if it gets to the point in which what the federal government says that I have to do versus what God says in His Word, then I've got to go with God. And it may cost me. And if it does, then the Bible also says it is better to suffer for doing good than it is to suffer for doing wrong. And God identifies with that. In the late 20th century, Lipscomb's view of God's kingdom and pacifism tied so closely to it had been long forgotten among churches of Christ. And even his biographers do not bring out Lipscomb's belief in an earthly millennial kingdom. And such views appeared strange, irrelevant, and disturbing, if not blatantly heretical to most people in the 20th century tradition. Now that within itself, I think, kind of draws this lesson to the close to help us to understand that there have been people that have led the church, that have taught individuals from a high position of understanding. And this paper that he had, the Gospel Advocate, for many years was just a sounding board of his ideas of getting it across. Just like Alexander Campbell's Millennial Harbinger was one that got forth many of his ideas. That oftentimes there comes a parting of the ways. And it has to happen. There's not always that we're going to always agree with everything that everybody says or does. And sometimes if we can't live with it, then we have to move on ourselves. That fact alone, I think, provides one telling indicator of the change that the churches of Christ underwent in the opening decades of the 20th century. Now, this study that we are in on Wednesday night is for the purpose of depicting some of these changes. First of all, changes that took place over 100 years ago, and the evolvement from those positions to where we are today. And I think that's what we get out of some of these lessons. I hope you'll be here next week. We're going to talk about God's chosen vessels. That'll be lesson number 13. If you haven't read that one, read that. It'll be good for you. Yes?
I just have one comment to make. My thinking is, and of course this is my personal opinion, that it does not matter to me whether Christ comes back and reigns 1,000 years or not. That's completely in God's hands and in God's realm. The thing that we need to remember is that in the very end of all of it is that we will no longer be humans. We will not be living in a human existence. We will be in a spiritual existence.
Right.
And as the book points out, how are the mails going to be carried? How would transportation and manufacturing be handled? We're not going to be dealing with all that in a spiritual being situation.
Well, evidently Mark Zuckerberg is going to take care of all of that for us. Times have changed. He's here. He'll live less than 100 years, and somebody else will be on the platform. Tom?
I don't believe you mentioned one of the things that I think is one of the worst things he taught. And that was his view on the silence of the Scriptures.
His view on the silence of the Scriptures. Okay, I'm not sure that was really in this particular lesson, was it? I think we may deal with this a little bit later on in another one of our lessons. We're dealing with what's there and what's not there, and what we'd like to see in there. That's an interesting viewpoint altogether.
It's led us in bad directions.
I think sometimes it really has. I think a lot of times we've not thought things through. About to get me on my stump here. We have oftentimes been right where we have accused our religious neighbors of only listening to what the preacher has to say and not looking at and studying it for ourselves. And when that happens, we're going to get in trouble because of opinion. And if we could just take opinion out of dictionary and say can't use that anymore, it's like the word can't. We need to take that out of the dictionary too, but those two words are both in there. We have been taught by what we call the foundation preachers who have taken positions upon different things, sometimes because of the silence of the Scriptures, of what's not said there, and at times what has been inferred or implied, and other times it's been a mess at times. And you probably have heard some things from the pulpit that on different occasions you said, "What? Where'd that come from?" Well, it came from the preacher. And sometimes we get it wrong too. So that's why we all need to study. Any other comments? Will you bow with me in prayer as we end our class? Oh Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for this study. Thank you for helping us understand some of the past of the church. We pray, Father, that you'll help us to be wise in our study and to be wise in our dealing with each other. Help us to have more love in our heart. Help us to have more service in our lives. We ask in Jesus' holy name. Amen.